My name is Hillary Jufer, and I'm here to talk about winter injury. So what we'll discuss today is the difference between abiotic and biotic disorders, and we'll also look at what causes these problems, what can be fixed or prevented by them, and just an idea of these winter injury problems. Are they biotic or abiotic? So the first thing we're going to do is get a good definition of abiotic and biotic. So this is the damage that's caused by these factors. It can be caused by something that's living or something that's non-living. And while they're vastly different at what causes them, they can look very similar. So even with looking at it, and an accurate diagnosis might be difficult. So for example, if you have browning of leaves on an oak tree, it could be, a stress from drought. It could be oak wilt. It could be a vascular anthracnose. So even though they look relatively the same or similar, the symptoms, it could be many different things. So biotic injury, and I'll just move us to here. so so biotic injury is something that's from a living organism, such as fungus, bacteria, virus, nematodes, mites, insects, and animals. So that's something that is alive causing the problem. So this first one we are not talking about in the program, but this is actually from a skunk grubbing, looking for grubs on a turf. So you might see these giant holes in the lawn and you're saying, what's going on? What's causing this? In this case, it's actually skunks. This second picture, so sorry, that would be biotic, right? The second picture is a picture of what boxwood blight looks like under a microscope. So this is fungal. So again, it would be biotic. I'm sure everyone knows this one. This is the aphid that can do some damage to plants. So again, biotic. And this is a fungus, which is tar spot on maple. And that is another example of something that's living that's causing the biotic damage. The abiotic injury is something that's not living. It's not caused by anything that is biotic of nature. It could be weather, it could be soils, chemicals, mechanical injuries, pretty much you name it, anything else, it can be that. It can be one single environmental event, or it could be something that's chronic. And you can also refer to it as a physiological disorder. So if we're looking again at the pictures, this one up here is actually a lightning strike on a tree. And this one down here, which you'll hear me talk about often in this program today, is going to be from de-icing salts. So if we go back to that first abiotic versus biotic slide, let's figure it out. So this is a snake plant. And you see it's brown, it's mushy. I'm looking at it, I'm trying to decide what it is. And this one is actually overwatering. So that's gonna be abiotic because it's not caused by something living. This one right here in the middle is a boxwood, and this is that boxwood blight that we saw in the last slide. So this one is biotic because it's a living fungus. This one here is a beech tree with beech leaf disease, and beech leaf disease is caused by a nematode, at least partially. So that is going to be something that is biotic because it's a live nematode. Everyone in Westchester's best friend, the deer. If you have some deer damage to your plants, it's definitely going to be biotic in nature. This one in the middle is actually a tomato plant that's turning purple, and you're kind of like, what might that be? There's two options. It could be maybe a potassium deficiency in the leaves, or it could be that you planted them and it was just too cold still. So both of those would be abiotic in nature because it's not something living. And then this final one here is some Pachysandra. And while it looks absolutely crazy, it is abiotic. A lot of times that's due to the de-icing salts that are used, or not too much sun, things of that nature. So that is usually abiotic. How can I tell the difference between abiotic and biotic? You know, it takes it takes some time and some practice, but it's definitely doable. So abiotic damage often occurs on many plant species, so across plant species, whereas biotic problems are more limited to specific species. So I look at this top picture. Granted, it's not outside, it's on a windowsill with house plants, but I'm noticing that every single one of these plants has some browning, you know, has some death, looks kind of funky. So I'm going to look at it and say, these are all different species in these plants. So we're thinking it's most likely abiotic, and it could be, again, overwatering or underwatering. That kind of thing would cause this problem. So abiotic damage does not spread from plant to plant, whereas biotic damages can spread through plants next to each other or in the neighborhood by wind, by rain, that kind of thing. So I'm looking at my boxwoods along the line here, and I'm like, oh my God, there's something, it's going through the bottom section of my boxwood. So automatically I'm looking to see what it is. Is there, and this goes to the bottom point, the biotic diseases can show physical evidence of pathogens. So am I seeing fungal spores? Am I seeing bacterial ooze? Am I seeing presence of insects? Am I seeing anything like that? No, I'm not. So, you know, what could it be? It's that abiotic damage that's looks like it might be spreading, but in reality, there's a path right there. So de-icing salt was just sprayed across all of them as they went and dealt with that. So if you're not seeing different the evidence of something biotic, it is likely the abiotic. Can it be both? Absolutely. Plants do often see biotic and abiotic problems at the same time. What you're going to want to do is look for the primary problem and separate it from the secondary factors. So diseases and insects are often really interested in plants that are already stressed out. So you're going to try to want to see what's causing that stress. This is an example of a beetle that actually causes oak wilt. So they're attracted to these fresh cuts. They're attracted to the nicks from a lawnmower, to that abiotic damage. And that's when they come in and colonize. And that's when you'll see the physical wound getting infiltrated because the tree was stressed and it was like, hey, come over here. I'm perfect for you. So it definitely has the possibility of being both. And if it is, you know, you want to kind of sift through and see what's primary and what's secondary. So now that we've talked about the difference between abiotic, which is non-living, and biotic, which is living factors, let's go through some of the things that you might see from the winter. So sun scald is one of the possibilities that you'll see, and it looks like elongated, sunken, dried, or cracked areas of dead on the bark. So you can see it like right here and right here. It's usually on the southwest side of the trees, and its cause isn't really well understood, but they think it could be from the temperature fluctuations because on cold days, the sun can warm the bark to the point where that area unfreezes. And when the sun sets or is shaded by a cloud, the tissue then refreezes and dies from that cycle. And it's usually seen in young trees, newly planted trees, and trees that have thin bark are usually what's going to be the most susceptible to sun scald. One that's very similar are frost cracks. And frost cracks are, again, cold temperatures that can cause thin bark on young trees to crack. And it usually happens on trees that are directly in sun in the winter, and you can see like the crack going all the way down, and here it is here. And it can reopen each year in extreme cold temperatures. They think Scientists believe that it is actually a result from water moving out of the cells and freezing during the sudden drops of temperature. Though, because the wood close to the surface shrinks as water is lost quickly, and then the inner wood is likely not affected. And then the sudden change of temperature creates a pressure between the two zones, resulting in the crack and splitting open. There are many common trees that are prone to frost cracks, most commonly on sycamores, but also on maples, apples, cherries, horse chestnuts, lindens, walnuts, and willows. And the younger trees are definitely more prone to it. So how can I protect from sun scald and frost cracks? You're going to want to leave the lower branches on the trees as much as possible, and you're going to want to avoid unnecessary wounding of the trunk. Make sure that if you're mowing and weed whacking, that kind of stuff, you're not going up against the tree, you're not causing any problems with that. You're going to want to prevent drought stress for the first 2 to 5 years, especially. They have these bags right here. You might see them referred to as a gator bag, or they have other ones called donut bags. You'll be able to put water in those. So if you have a site that you can't get to regularly or something like that, there's water there. In the fall, you're going to want to wrap the tree trunk with a plastic tree guard, and it will help to prevent the sun from being directly on it. You don't want it to be tight to the tree because you don't want it to girdle. And you definitely want to remove it in the spring so that you don't have any problems. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is another abiotic factor is snow damage, which is commonly thought of as ice, snow, and wind during the winter. Branches can bend and break, and wind during ice storms can cause a lot of damage itself. The wind can be a problem. Heavy snow can also be problematic on multi-stemmed evergreens. Things like yews, arborvitae, and juniper are going to have a lot of problem because of this storm damage. And this picture up here, it's kind of hard to see, but you're seeing this yew up top is broken due to the snow load. So it's definitely a possibility. You can see branches falling down here. So you have snow. You're in New York. We did get a little snow this year. What do I do? If it's safe to knock off the snow from low branches, do so, only if it's safe. If there's branches that have ice over them, do not try to knock off the ice. Branches with ice tend to be more brittle and will suffer more damage if you try to remove it. So that you just want to leave alone. White pines in our area are especially prone to winter ice and wind damage. So that's just an idea of one tree that you might see this on often. You're going to want to assess the tree health regularly and prune anything that's problematic anytime throughout the year. If there's something that's hazardous, or there's something that puts your safety at risk, you're going to want to prune. And for multi-stemmed evergreens, you're going to want to tie the shrub around with twine, not too tight, and don't make knots directly tight onto the tree. You want it to be relatively giving, I guess you could say. So from there, we're going to go into leaf desiccation. Leaf desiccation, you might also hear it as winter burn or winter scorch. And before we do that, we're going to have a quick botany lesson. So we're going to talk about plant transpiration, which is also known as it's the water that's lost through the leaves. So when it rains, when you water a plant, the water is going to be taken in through the roots. It's going to move up the column. And when it transpires, the water leaves the leaves. So you might hear it referred to as a stoma, a stomate, or a stomata. Same thing. You can think of the stomata as the gateway for water to leave. So if I were to zoom in on one of these leaves, you would see this. And here's the open stomata, and that's how the water escapes. And again, here's a more in-depth side view. And you can see they have the guard cells that let things out. So when I'm talking about leaf desiccation, I'm talking about the amount of water lost by transpiration is greater than what's taken in by the roots, because all trees lose water during normal metabolic processes, even in winter. During the growing season, when trees are in full foliage, large amounts of water are lost through their leaves, but they're also taking in a lot of water. During winter, the photosynthesis is slowed down, but evergreens do continue to lose water at a higher rate than deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves through their needles. So this leaf desiccation has the ability to happen. So how does it happen? Bright sunny days, photosynthesis is taking place, respiration is taking place. So there's an increased water loss, even though it's the winter. Also, it can happen on windy days when it's been dry, and if there's a lack of snow cover, because the soil will freeze more deeply with a lack of snow cover, making moisture unavailable to be taken in by the trees and shrubs. So the takeaway for that is, if the soil is frozen or dry, roots cannot take in enough water, because they're going to take in the water here and continue the transpiration process. So if it is dry or frozen, they they can't take in enough, and there's more transpiration, which leads to this burning. Commonly affected evergreens, you have for broadleaf evergreens, you have holly, boxwood, rhododendron, and up here is a picture of a boxwood. For needled evergreens, you have fir, hemlock, yew, and spruce. Here is a yew down here. And for scale-like leaves, you have arborvitae, juniper, and false cypress. And here is a picture of an arborvitae. And these are important because it's going to, if you choose to do something about it, you have to pay attention to what kind of leaves, what kind of needles they have. So we'll talk about at the end, but so it's always good to know what you have. The symptoms for this is normally a reddish brown color on the foliage that starts at the tips of the branches and moves inward. Usually the foliage facing south and southwest or west is more often affected, and the symptomatic foliage will drop in the spring. And you might see it in the spring, you might even see it in midsummer. It's not something that you're going to see right away most of the time, and it could continue to be problematic. So you have some damage. Now what do? So you're going to prune out any adversely affected growth and dead stem. New growth will cover what you're seeing, but so know that you do have time. It will be okay. And if the new growth hasn't come out yet, you can just scratch the bark of the area of the affected branches and look to see if it's green. If the tissue is green underneath, you're probably gonna, that means it's still alive. Whereas if it were brown or if it were easily snappable, then we'd start to worry and maybe cut that off. But if it's still green underneath, if the bud tissue is still green, you're likely going to see new foliage. So you'll just want to give it a little bit more time. You're going to want to water it regularly and fertilize it as needed. You don't need to add fertilizer, but to get a soil test and see if it's needed. It might be, but you're not going to just go out and apply fertilizer. You're going to get a soil test to see if it's something that needs to be done. And the hardest part is you're going to wait. Because you might see this in, end of winter, you might see it in the spring, you might see it in the summer, you might send us a picture and we might say, yeah, that's just winter damage. Just wait and see what happens. And I know it's very hard, but that's the biggest thing to do. Is it preventable? Preventable? Yeah. Right plant, right place. So you want to buy plants that are rated as cold hardy for your location, as well adapted to local soil and growing conditions. You're going to want to avoid planting winter injury sensitive evergreens in sunny and windy areas. Instead, if you have that, you're going to want to plant sensitive and marginally cold hardy plants on the northeast or east side of the building to have protection, or don't plant them at all, because you know you're going to have problems, and that goes back to the right plant, right place. Maybe you find something that's a little bit better for your area rather than trying to plant something that you know you're going to have problems with. You're going to want to avoid planting evergreens after October, just so that you give them exactly what they need to have that root growth, to take in that water, so you don't have those problems moving through winter. You're going to want to avoid pruning and fertilizing evergreens in late summer and fall, because you'll get a flush of new growth that won't have time to harden off. So it likely will die, that portion of it, in the winter months with the temperatures and the elements. And you're going to want to apply 2 inches of mulch to insulate roots from the cold. And you're not going to want to go up to the trunk of it. You're going to want to give it a few inches around the trunk, just so that you get some protection for the roots, but then also not a reservoir to get disease and insects into the trunk. And you can create wind barriers if needed. So these are 2 examples of wind barriers. You're going to use burlap canvas, snow fencing, or any other protective material. You'll notice that there's nothing over the top. You'll also notice that it's not tightly against them. And this one, see, you know, they have the problem from this side. It looks like there might be a driveway right here, so they don't even have the other side covered. And just know that the materials will degrade if you have a significant rain or snow event. You might need to redo it, but they should be helpful. They're not going to prevent water loss, but they'll prevent the potential for some windburn. So another possibility is frost or cold damage in ornamentals, abiotic. So we just talked about the specifically about about evergreens. Now we're going to talk about ornamentals as a whole. And it could be dependent on a few factors, things like, well, any and all these factors, really. It could be temperature, where the temperature's low for a long period of time, where they just really low for overnight, like last year, 2 years ago. The plant species is going to vary based on where you have it, the exposure, the stage of plant growth. You know, all these things are going to play a role in what's going on. So frost damage to flowers and buds. Flowers of early blooming plants can turn brown, limp, and mushy. You can see that right here. They can damage or destroy unopened flower buds, and while it does look unsightly, there's no true damage to the tree happening. So the early bloomers have a problem losing flowers if there's a late season cold snap. So if it gets a cold snap late, you'll see things like this magnolia. Early season bloomers that have these problems are magnolia, forsythia, rhododendron, azalea are common to have big problems with this. Bud damage for those buds that are just about to pop but didn't yet. You could see some crabapple problems. You can see ornamental cherry and lilac problems. If you want to look for something that's a little less susceptible, you can try the cherry dogwood and the vernal witch hazel, which is this picture right here. So a lot of the times with the witch hazel, like you'll even see some snow on it, and there's no real damage to the flowers a lot of times. So we just talked about it as an abiotic function because there's nothing live causing the problem. It's the weather. So we talked about it on buds and flowers. Now we're going to talk about it on leaves. So the symptoms of that are browning and blackening of leaf tissues, shriveling, damage, growth becoming limp, which you can see right here in this pin oak. It kind of just becomes limp and sags, and the leaves can fall often as well. Most of the time the trees will leaf out again, and just like with the flowers, healthy, well-established plants will have little harm done by this. So even though you might lose the flowers with the last one, or you might lose the leaves and have it re-leaf out, not the end of the world for a healthy tree. So common plants affected: Japanese maple, I mean, there's a whole long line. Ginkgo, this is a ginkgo right here. And this is another oak. They have really good pictures because they're really good at doing this. But you know, so there's a whole bunch of trees that this is common on. Most maples, birches, green ash, honey locust, lilacs, lindens, viburnum don't see much damage in these kinds of cases. So I have any kind of desiccation going on. What do I do? Again, you're going to want to monitor the tree and shrub time. You're going to want to see what's going on over the next year or two. You want to water during dry periods, and you should aid in the watering of these trees for 3 to 5 years after planted, just to make sure that you're getting what needs to be done. You're going to want to remove dead branches at any point because you don't want to have them be hazardous. And for this, again, fertilizer is not recommended. Get a soil test, see if it's needed, but in this instance, fertilizing won't make it better. Okay, we're still going on the abiotic tour of winter damage. We're going to talk about de-icing salt damage now. A lot of de-icing salts are sodium chloride. It's what's used the most, also called rock salt. A lot of times it's the cheapest as well, so it's used quite often. The damage tends to be noticed in late winter or spring if it's an evergreen, but if it's a deciduous plant and lost all of its leaves, you're not going to notice until the plant starts to grow again in the spring. So I have the list of symptoms, but you can kind of start to see, you can guess what I'm going to say about what the symptoms may be. The damage is mostly on the side of the plant facing the road or sidewalk, because that's where the salt's coming from. Browning or discoloration of needles or foliage beginning at the tips. There's going to see a lot of damage, delayed bud break, reduction or distorted leaf or stem growth, wilting, and then it can go on all year. Wilting during hot, dry condition, witches' brooms, which if you think of a witch and a witch holding a broom, it's just exactly that. You know, you have all the growth out of the top. You know, you could have the flowers and fruit development be delayed or smaller than normal, needle tip burn. So all that we're talking about. So down here you can see the brownish color starting at the top of the needles, or like we had that picture at the beginning, this is of the Pachysandra. So how does it happen? Salt spray from trucks and passing cars can get into the beds and into everything. You can have dissolved salts in water runoff. You can have snow and salt shoveled onto grass or onto garden beds, just like this. You shovel a little bit, you put some salt down, and then an hour or 2 hours you have to shovel again, but now that salt's mixed in it and you're throwing it over the side into your plants. So this is something that can be seen often with that. Which, as an aside, you know, you might see this burn as well with fertilizers, because fertilizer is just salt, but that's not necessarily a winter injury topic. But just as a note, you can see it during the growing season too, potentially. How do you want to manage excess salt? You're going to want to reduce the amount of salt that you use, and instead for traction you can use something like sawdust, sand, kitty litter, that kind of thing. You want to try to use less rock salt, and I just put different salts that you can use that may be a little bit more expensive, but they can reduce the injury to plants. You're going to want to target applications in walkways or driveways instead of, haphazardly throwing it around or putting it in a spreader and letting it go everywhere. So really target where you're doing it. You want to use salt tolerant plants around roadways. You want to use preventative barriers like we saw with the burlap around that driveway. If you know you have some sensitive areas, you can try to prevent it. And if you find that you have an area that has a lot of salt in it that you're finding out as spring comes on, if there's any salt laden areas, you just want to irrigate it and help get that salt through the soil profile. So just constant irrigation will help with that. Like I said, you want to put in salt tolerant plants if it's something that it's an area of concern. So this is a list from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. There's lists of all different plants for all different problems. So you can always take a look and go to one of these lists and say, oh, I have a problem with salt spray. Okay, well, maybe I'll put this maple in instead of something that has a big problem with it. So you want to give that a try. Okay. We made it through the abiotic. So we just talked about everything that's not related to something living. So the weather, salt, any kind of damage, things like that, that's not from something living. And now we're going on to the biotic. So the first thing we're going to talk about is voles that are also called meadow mice. These are biotic. So there's 23 species of voles in the United States, and there are 4 found in the Northeast. The 2 in our area are the meadow vole and the pine vole. They tend to have small ears and eyes compared to like a house mouse. So to know the difference, a meadow vole's tail is longer than its hind legs. And you can see a pine vole's tail is not. So a great way to figure out which one you have is by looking at that tail comparatively to their hind legs. The meadow vole, which is this guy right here, usually causes plant damage above the ground, and they can be 5.5 to 7.5 inches long. The pine vole usually lives underground, and they girdle the plants in the root systems, and they can be a little bit smaller, about 4 to 6 inches. And they live their life through runways. And again, since they are a little different, pine voles are found, their runways are found underground. Meadow voles runways are at the surface. They're about 1 to 2 inches wide. You can kind of see them going around right here. They clear the vegetation near the runways. It's clipped very low. And you can find feces and vegetation within the runways. And there we go. That's one reason, if we were looking to see if it was an abiotic problem or not and didn't see the voles, we have the evidence. We have the physical evidence of the feces there. So we know it's a biotic problem. What they damage, the runways can damage lawns, home lawns, golf courses, and ground covers. They can also chew and girdle trees and orchards and in ornamentals. It's usually noticed in the it usually happens in the late fall and winter, but noticed in the spring or, later. And when you look at the marks on these trees, they're about an 1/8 inch wide, 3/8 inch long, and 1/16 inch deep. So they're small, which will help us differentiate them from some of the other animals that we're talking about today. So you're going to want to look at the burrow systems and the tracks to determine if it is a vole or not. There's definitely ways to modify the habitat to prevent them from coming. You're going to want to remove or modify bird feeders so that there's less spillage, so there's less food. You're going to want to eliminate ground covers if you have them. I know not everyone's going to want to eliminate ground covers, but you can, and you could just do a repeated close mowing or an herbicide. You can cultivate the soil to destroy those burrows, and you want to not have these here, which is just kind of like a plastic covering. It's a great secluded runway for them that they don't have to make. And you want to, this is the only time you'll ever hear me say this, but you want to mow less than 2 inches high, which is normally not recommended. But if you have the pest and it is becoming a problem, you know, mowing less will give them less of a cover. And the voles can be attracted to natural and synthetic mulches and these mats that I was talking about before. So if I look at these three pictures, they are attracted to the synthetic mulches, weed prevention mats. The only mulches that they are not gonna go through are large chunks of pine bark or stone. So, you know, if you have a problem with them, they can tunnel under shredded pine bark. So don't use that. Stone works well, and the large pine bark. So just something to look out for if you do have them. So you have them. What now? No frightening devices are effective for voles. There are labeled repellents. Make sure you follow the instructions on the label. Capsaicin tends to work well for them when looking at research. Toxicants are restricted to pesticide professionals, so there's no ready to use for homeowners. You'd have to go to someone to do it for your property. Mouse traps work really well. You can see here, they like it when they're covered because they're used to those runways, and having them covered also helps pets and children not be able to access them. So it's a double win. They like apple slices, bait it with an apple slice. Relocation is not recommended, and it's also illegal to take them off of your property if you do not have wildlife permits. So if you do have something that you would like to take off your property, you're going to have to call in someone with a wildlife permit. You can do vole exclusion. You're going to want to use a wire cage, which is a hardware cloth, or you want to do a tree guard like we were talking about before. The guard should reach higher than the deepest anticipated snow depth for winter. So say it's 10 feet, you're going to have the 10 feet, 10 inches. You're going to have these at least 10 inches above, you know. So keep an eye of what amount of snow you're going to be seeing potentially this year. And the plastic arts can be less effective. And I only say less effective because they can break down in UV light and they might unfurl depending on which kind you have. So just make sure that you keep an eye on them and see if you need to change them at all. The next one that we're going to talk about is the eastern cottontail rabbit. Again, biotic living. They can damage trees and shrubs and other more ornamentals. They clip the twigs and girdle the bark. You're going to notice that they're different because they clip the twigs at a 45-degree angle, and they frequently feed on garden vegetables in the summer and plants in flower beds. You're going to look at them, you're going to know it's them because they're gray to gray brown with a rusty brown spot on the nape of their neck, which you can see here. Their hind feet are much longer than their front feet. And they have a cotton tail on the bottom of their tail. It's a little white spot that looks like a cotton ball. And they're usually 15 to 19 inches and about 2 to 4 pounds. And I saw one, I think, last week, 2 weeks ago. So they are indeed out during the winter. Like I said, with the rabbit damage, you're going to see a more of a 45-degree angle cut, and they can cause 20 inches of damage. So if you're going to have, again, 10 inches of snow potentially, you have to have the whatever you're using 30 inches up. So the 10 inches of potential snow and then 20 inches that a rabbit can get to. So you're talking about kind of high up. They really like mountain ash, red maple, sugar maple, apple, cherry, white oak, willow, and definitely as younger trees, you'll see more damage. You'll see just like here, you see how far up these are going. Here's the snow cover. They're going all the way up the tree. You can do rabbit habitat modification. You're going to want to remove brush piles, wood piles, debris, and any other cover. And you want to use plants that rabbits do not prefer. So an option, like if you were planting tulips, bad idea. You might want to plant daffodils instead of tulips. And they might eat it still, depending on what other food they have around. But rabbits are most always found near protective escape cover, so you'll definitely want to remove those piles. Now what? No frightening devices are effective for rabbits. There are labeled repellents. Again, they said that the capsaicin works well, but there's no research to back that up. That's just something that they noticed while doing research. Toxicants are not labeled for use on rabbits, and box traps are really effective. Again, they like apples. You can do it with apples, and you cannot take them off of your property. They found that it's not effective, but again, without having a license, you cannot physically move something off of your property. So there's that too. Again, rabbit exclusion. You can do a 2-foot fence with the bottom tight against the ground or buried in. If you have a garden, then the hardware cloth 20 inches tall plus the anticipated snow amount, same as the voles, really. Again, this is another what you should plant. So there's lists for everything that you can look and see what is a better option for you. And then we're going to start talking about deer, which everyone I know knows about. So this is just some numbers from Dr. Paul Curtis at Cornell. They're rather old, but they get the job done. You can see what they're talking about. In 1995, 2.4 million US homes were impacted by deer, costing over $250 million in damages annually. Deer cost Westchester County residents between $6.5 and $9.5 million in 1987. The average plant replacement cost was $475 per home, and the used rhododendron and arborvitae were most frequently damaged. So they're here. And just think these numbers are from 1987, 1995. Think about how much it's changed. So we have two pieces of damage here, two damaged limbs. So one of these is deer. I'll give you a second to see if you kind of can think of what it is. So this one here is indeed deer. This one is our rabbit friend. So remember, the rabbits have that 45-degree angle cut, which is how you can tell it's them. Deer have a browse line of 6 feet. So if you see something that has, the first 6 feet, that doesn't look so good, and then a nice little lollipop, it can often be referred to as lollipopping. You're going to know that it's in the back of your head that it might be deer. They have no canine teeth, so they chomp down and they twist and turn to rip. So they leave an ugly, jagged, bite, I guess you can say, versus the rabbit where it's really clean. And they can permanently disfigure that ornamental if it's done throughout, yearly, and it could negatively affect the fruit yield too. So exclusion is your best friend with deer. And while an 8-foot barrier fence is going to be the most effective, you can see it down here. It doesn't have to look exactly like this. If that's not a possibility, you can always just protect individual plants. If you're doing individual trees, you're going to want to have woven wire or plastic cylinders at least 6 foot high, because that's their browse line. And then you can also use electric fences. They're very commonly used in on farms. And they are kind of less effective on large fields, but a lot electronic fences work really well on farms. If you don't follow those rules, you'll see this. You know, if there's something that's high value enough for them, they can hop a fence. So, you know, you definitely want to try to do the 8-foot fence if you can. Frightening devices are only minimally effective. They acclimate quickly to noises and new features in their environment. They're especially if they're motivated by hunger. The repellents may work when deer pressure and damage is light. So if you have high deer damage, repellents probably won't work. The best repellents are putrescent egg, whole egg solids. They found that work very well when researched on. You've also probably heard of things like human hair and soap, but they do not show effectiveness when tested. So you're going to want to make sure you follow the labeled instructions for repellents. And the effectiveness is highly variable, and it's variable because it depends on the alternative food sources, the density of deer, the habitats, the movement of individual deer. You know, there's all these factors that go into it, and it must be repeated. These repellents must be repeated every 4 to 5 weeks when deer are feeding. And sometimes you can't, you know, sometimes in cold temperatures, if it's snowy or it's rainy, you can't do it. And then all of a sudden the effectiveness goes out the window. So definitely look and see what you might want to do, and trial and error and see if it works based on all of these different factors. So this is a list that we have on our website about different plants that are resistant to deers. Again, just because it's on its list, you know, I like the saying, you know, the deer don't read what they're not supposed to eat. So just because it's here doesn't mean it won't be eaten. It's just less likely to be eaten based on all those factors, the deer presence, what they have, you know, what's fenced in and what's not, all those different factors. So I have some damage. Now what do I do? So this is actually a vole damage. But you know, vole, rabbits, deer, anything like that. Again, take a deep breath and wait. You're going to want to monitor it through the spring. You do not want to treat the wound with dressings or paints, because that's really just going to seal in decay and problems. You're going to want to provide adequate moisture, and look for secondary. We were talking about that secondary pathogen coming in. If you have holes in the bark and things like that, look for diseases and insects that are going to capitalize and come in. And if damage is severe, the plant will likely not survive. And I would say in this situation, I I agree with that, especially because it has, you know, a full circle of damage, which is going to cut off some of that way for the nutrients and water to get up through. So it's girdling the tree and it will most likely die. And then one option that has kind of fallen out of favor, but was used quite often in the past, is anti-desiccants. And these are applied to plants to reduce water loss through transpiration. So this is going to plug those stomata, and that's what its main way of working is. It is not a guarantee to prevent injury. Rather, it's going to reduce the moisture lost. And it does not prevent against plant cells being damaged from temperatures. So tests indicate they are most useful when the air temperature is above freezing, but the soils are still frozen or cold. So it can cause weaker plants that are more susceptible to stress because you're closing those stomata and you're preventing all the gas exchange, all the water exchange, all that. So it can cause a stressed plant in the long run because they reduce leaf moisture loss, and that also reduces the amount of carbon dioxide allowed to pass through the stomata and all that kind of stuff. So they were really in fashion, but they're seeing that it could be problematic in the long run. If you are going to use one, read the label. You want to know, what can it be used on? Is the label for use saying broadleaf and needled evergreens? It didn't say scale-like leaves, so that means you can't use them on junipers or arborvitae, which means that it may actually encourage winter injury on those plants. When can and when can't I apply it? Some anti-desiccants dry more slowly during afternoons and evenings, causing the film ingredients to separate. So you have to think about, when should I apply it? And if they separate, it could cause poor protection or a white frosty film, which a lot of times people think are aesthetically not pleasing. What do I need to spray? Do I need to spray? Is it a concentrate that needs to be diluted and sprayed? Is it something that's a ready to use product, so it's ready to go? If you have to put it in a sprayer, it could get, it's a really sticky product, so it could clog the sprayer. Make sure you clean immediately and take a look and see what the label says on how to do that. And then think about, how often do I have to reapply it? Sometimes they say every 4 to 6 weeks, and they might say not when temperatures are below X, or it might be raining or snowing, so it might be when you need to respray it the most, you can't. And then you'll have this damage. So just keep an eye out if you are thinking about using these products, the good and the bad. Oops. So how can I tell everything apart? Great question. Patience, a good eye, and a little research, and happy to help whenever we can. You can always send us an email or give us a phone call, and send us pictures or anything, and we'll definitely be able to take a look at it all and help you through the process of figuring it out. All right. And I don't know if there are any questions, Amy, but thank you for having me speak.
Great. Thank you, Hillary. If you want to just run the last couple of slides, we do have a bunch of questions, and we'll get through as many of them in the next 5 minutes. If not, if you have time to stay on for a few minutes, we could keep going. But I want to, in case people have to jump off, we do hope to see you next month with gardening in a changing climate. And following slide, please.
Yep.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone again for your generosity in supporting our program. And we are a tax exempt organization. Thanks so much. And we can, I guess, I don't know if you want to just stop sharing, maybe.
Sure.
We can get to the questions. The first question is, how do you determine whether a recently planted shrub needs watering in warm or periodically warm winter?
So you're going to want to think of it as they do. If it was recently planted, you're going to want to, at least for the first 2 years, and you'll think about, you want about an inch of water a week, inclusive of rainfall. So yes, you're gonna wanna, if there's a dry period, if there's a hot period, you're definitely gonna want to supplement that for at least the first 2 to 3 years.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And in the winter, the soil doesn't dry as quickly. But if you do notice that it's drying out, then definitely water would be helpful. You also want to be careful that if you water and then it really freezes, you want to make sure that you don't cause freeze injury that way too. But for the most part, once in this area, at least if we have enough rain, then you don't have to worry so much, but you should keep an eye on it. So thanks so much. The next question is, in the case of boxwood having damage from road salt, how do you fix that? Will the bottom branches ever green up again? It depends. So
Yeah.
take it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. You can try some of those. You can try maybe to protect it with that burlap. You can try, know if you know that you have a problem with road salt, irrigate it in the spring, cut back anything that's damaged. But that might be an example of, is that the right plant for the right location? And it might be something that you want to consider changing for something that's a little bit more okay with salt. And you can find out all those by just looking at all the different information out there that'll show you what's salt tolerant.
Yes, and I believe we have a list of that too. Maybe we could send with our resources as well.
Definitely.
Long Island has, I think, has that list. And then people want to know, does the damage continue to affect the tree even during the summer?
You'll see it into
Yes.
the summer potentially. Yeah, and it definitely, it's a stress plant. So you'll see problems from it. So that's again where you just make sure that you're looking at it, you're looking at any symptoms that might pop up from something secondary, you're making sure to irrigate. You're treating it like your baby, right? You're making sure that everything is going all right to compensate for the fact that it's a little bit stressed.
Thank you. Yes, and we do see samples of winter injury and calls even into the spring quite
Yeah.
often.
hmm
Okay, and who do you call again to remove bunny family undershed?
Um, if you it's not so so the thing is, it's not incredibly effective to do that. You'd want to call someone who has a pest not pest a wildlife removal license. But the thing is, if you try to remove a family of bunnies or anything underneath a shed, you're going to want to make sure that once they're gone, you're stopping something else from coming in its place. Because if you just remove them and leave them as is, then you're going to have the same problem because a new bunny family is going to come and love it. So you're going to want to make sure that you're making it less habitable. You're putting hardware cloth underneath it so nothing can burrow in. You're getting rid of the overflowing seed from those birds that are making a huge mess, maybe transition to a different bird feeder. You're getting rid of any water or food or those patches of twigs and brush that they can hide in. So you can have them removed by someone who has a wildlife oh my goodness, license to do so, but then you want to modify your yard so that nothing else comes in to live there instead.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, then another question here was about going back to the plant options about the screen up. I think that's referring to the deer list, the list of deer plants. We do have that on our website, and we can include that with our resources as well.
Definitely.
And then it looks like, oh, okay, there's a couple more questions coming in here, including a lot of wonderful and thank you comments. So thank you for that. And then one was saying last year, many of my butterfly bushes took a long time to come back and a few did not come back. And how do you tell early on if the bush is late or dead?
Yeah, so you can I talked about it a little bit, but you can go over to a branch and you can scrape back some of the bark and see if it's green. If it's green, you're good, it's alive, it should come back. If it's brown or, black or something like that, that part of it isn't alive. So you can start at the top and do that and go down and down and down. If it is starting off brown, you can go back and see at what part it becomes green, what part is still alive, or maybe none of it is. You can also do the same thing where you can just take a branch in your hand and you can bend it a little bit. And if it has some give and it can bend, it's likely still alive. But if it snaps, it it likely isn't. So you can do the same thing where you can scratch or you can bend all the way down to see where the live tissue is and if there is any.
Yeah, and then wait too,
Yeah.
because sometimes the injury does progress. Okay.
Yeah, winter injury is a lot of weight. And I know it can be hard, but that is definitely a lot of what it is.
Great, great. Thanks so much. Okay. Question here is about dog urine. Is it worse than in the summer?
I think that I have some dog urine spots in my house as well,
Mhm.
well, on my turf. Um, I think what makes it worse is if it's in the same spot over and over, be it summer or winter. If possible, which you can't quite tell your dog where to go, but if you can try to encourage different spots throughout the yard. And again, that's one of those things where it's actually just it's extra nutrients. So you can kind of try to irrigate it away in the spring too, to kind of try to get it from the burn that's happening from it.
Great, thank you. Okay, and it looks like we've got one last question here about watering with soft water. Is that needed, I guess, or spring water or something like that?
You should just be able to water with, the water you have in your hose. If you're worried about the content in it, you might want to reach out to the health department and have it tested to see if there's a need for anything different. But, you should be able to use tap water unless you're inside and doing inside plants. If you are doing inside plants, you might want to let the water sit for 24 hours, just kind of get the what is I can't
Or the
remember.
chlorine?
Chlorine, yeah, to kind of get the chlorine out for indoor plants. But you shouldn't have to do any of that for your outdoor plants. And if you're worried, I would definitely reach out to the health department to have it tested.